Great. Hi, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our fourth and last session of our Global Climate Advocacy training. I'm Charlotte from South South North. I'll just open the session before handing over to our speakers. Welcome if you have been joining us. Welcome back. If you are just joining us now, don't worry, you can catch up on the recordings of the previous 3 sessions. Just some quick housekeeping is to please ensure that your Zoom tag has your name and organization so we can get to know who you are and where you're coming from. Please make sure you're on mute. And if you have a question for one of our speakers, you can use the Q&A box, or you can post in the chat box if you have a comment. If we do have time for question and answer during the session, you can also raise your hand and we can have a spoken conversation together. We do have interpretation today. Next slide, please, Karen. Yeah, we've got interpretation in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Indonesian Bahasa. So please feel free to speak in any of those languages today or type in any of those languages. If you are an English speaker like myself, please make sure that you are in the English channel so that you can hear others. And if you have any issues with Zoom or need any technical support, you're welcome to message the host, which is South South North. My colleague Karen is on standby to support. Otherwise, you can email info@southsouthnorth.org. Great. I can see a question coming up already about the English channel. So if you are in your Zoom interface, your bottom toolbar, you might have to click on More to see the interpretation options and then just select English. There should be 5 options available to you there. Okay, if you have been joining us or you're part of VCA already, you know us well. But for those of you who are new, we're an alliance. We're based in 7 different countries. We have over 200 civil society partners who are part of our network, who are all aiming to advance locally led climate action. And one of our objectives is to strengthen local voices, particularly from the Global South, at global decision-making spaces. And because COP29 is one of those key spaces this year, we are very much hoping to use this training that we're joining today to support you with your advocacy objectives in that space, which can be very challenging and complicated to navigate. So we hope that this session that we're running today and the previous 3 sessions have helped you to get a bit closer to achieving those goals and having your voices and your objectives realized in those spaces. Next slide, Karen. Great. If you have been able to join the previous sessions, you'll know that we also have a number of other really great resources that we have put together to help everybody who's planning to either attend COP29 or COP30 in the future, who is interested in engaging in those spaces or just learning about how to participate throughout the year and virtually in the COPs and some of the other UN spaces. So we have resources on how to become accredited as an NGO observer to the UNFCCC. We have a space talking about the CBD COP, which is taking place in Colombia in October. And we have another webinar on how to engage at COP from last year, which you can also check out. And we are putting together a position paper, which should be published soon, on the importance of recognizing local voices within global spaces like the UNFCCC. So please look out for those. All our resources will be shared with you over email, including a recording of today's session. So don't worry about that. It will be recorded and shared with you, hopefully very soon after the session is finished. And we will have some opportunities for further engagement, which Marina can share with you more about. Great. Okay, so I hope today is really engaging and useful to you. And with that, I will hand over to Marina from Interface Advocacy, who will take us through today's session. Thanks so much. Over to you, Marina.
Charlotte. Thank you. So let me share my screen so we can start. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So it's a privilege to be here with you all again. I'm here with my colleague Gustavo. We have introduced ourselves in the previous workshop. We are representatives of Interface Advocacy, and we're based in Brazil. Thanks again for the VCA, the Voices for Just Climate Action Alliance, for this invitation. And today we're talking about some advocacy tools. So we're going to introduce an advocacy practical guide. Agenda for today, we'll talk about so we started talking about some advocacy steps of this practical guide on the previous workshop. Today, we're going to talk about the stakeholders mapping, the advocacy narrative or advocacy communication plan, the advocacy tactics. We'll talk about issues management, monitoring and evaluating, and we'll also talk about a bonus opportunity that this training has. We'll talk about it in the end of the workshop, and we'll present you an advocacy plan template that we're going to leave for you to fill in and help your advocacy agendas on COP29 and COP30. So before we start, I just want to call your attention for the translation of the word advocacy. So as I said on the previous slide, there is no clear-cut definition for advocacy, right? In many countries, there is no regulation for the lobby and advocacy activities. And thus, this leads to a little bit of certain lack of clarity on how to use the terms. So as I said on the previous workshop, we are using the term advocacy on this training because advocacy is a broader term that encompasses both strategies from the lobby and the activism fields, okay? And in Portuguese and Spanish, I'd like to call your attention because there is a false cognate in these languages, which is advocacia, and it's not the same as advocacy. So we are still identifying which terms translate better the word advocacy. I'd like to share that in Portuguese, in most Portuguese-speaking countries, people are using the term in English, advocacy. So in Brazil, where I'm based, it's very common to use the term in English, or incidência política. Incidência política is also being adopted as a possible translation. And in most Spanish-speaking countries, incidência política has been the term that is being adopted more often. Okay, so I just like to call attention for these two languages because there is a false cognate that is advocacia, and advocacia refers to the law work done by attorneys. Okay, so let's from now on you're going to use in Portuguese either advocacy or incidência política, and in Spanish incidência política is more common. Okay, so before we start the content for today, I'd like to do a brief check-in. So I'd like to ask you to please write down a word or short sentence on the chat that translates your sentiment today regarding this training and your preparation for COP29, which is very close, happening in November. So please share a sentence or word. Some questions are things becoming more clear or less clear? Are you feeling confident or not? Do you have needs or doubts that weren't addressed yet? If so, please leave a comment and we'll check if we can address them during this workshop or later. So I'll pause for a moment to give you some time to leave your comments on the chat so that we can start. Can be just a word, just let us know how you are doing today. So Juan said that it's helping organize the activities, the work he has to do to accomplish, I imagine to accomplish before going to COP29. Okay, let's warm up and start, people. Share some of your feelings, thoughts, doubts. I'm curious to know what's happening with you today. Is there something we can be helpful on, some doubt or need you'd like to share? Okay, so I'm going to let you write on the chat, and Gustavo will let me know if there are other comments.
Rodrigo has just left a comment as well.
Okay, is this a need you have, Rodrigo? Do you want to understand better the mechanism, the funding mechanism that will be discussed at COP29? Okay, I guess this is something you'd like to explore more, understand better. Okay, so thank you for sharing. I'll share my screen again and let's start the content for today.
Ayandra has also just left a comment, Marina. I guess she wants to know better how to get bilateral meetings with the Brazilian government. I think that was covered in the first two sessions, but if you want to address that.
Yeah, so, okay, I see Tom says, I'm fine, ready for COP29, great. Hi, Andra. So this workshop, the tools we are presenting today, they were designed to help you maximize your activities at COP29 and COP30. So we won't discuss here exactly who are the stakeholders that you need to engage with, but we'll show tools, we'll provide tools that will help you plan your engagement activities for COP29, regardless of who are the stakeholders you want to engage with. So these tools, they serve to better prepare yourselves for these engagements, for reaching your goals. I cannot go like in specific, talking about specific needs of each organization and each government, but I can tell you that we are going to leave you a template in the end of this session that you can fill in according to your advocacy goals. And the bonus opportunity of this training is a coaching session. So up to 10 organizations will be selected to receive a coaching session to review the plan. So on this coaching session, we may talk about specific needs, specific stakeholders. So feel free, please, if you want, feel free to fill in the template that we're going to share by the end of the session and apply for this coaching session. And this will be a great opportunity to, refine your strategy for engaging with the Brazilian government. Okay, so let's start because we have a lot of content today. Thanks for sharing your comments, your needs. We'll see how to address them today or, afterwards. Okay, can you see my screen already? Yes. Okay, so I'm moving to the next slide. Can you see this? The next slide on the 7. Yeah, okay. So as we said on the previous workshop, this is a 7-step practical guide on advocacy. So in the previous workshop, we talked about the 2 first steps, which is choosing priorities and setting advocacy goals. We also talked about the importance of understanding the decision-making arena. So in this case, this work we're doing here, the decision-making arena is the UNFCCC and the COPs. So we talked about this on the 2 initial workshops of this training. So today we are going to address the other steps of this practical guide, which is identifying mapping stakeholders, creating your advocacy narrative or your advocacy communication, defining activities and timelines. So it has to do with your advocacy tactics, managing risks, and monitoring and evaluating results. So this is what we're going to talk about today. And by the end of the session, as I said, I'm going to talk about the bonus opportunity and the template that we have developed to help you plan for COP29 and COP30. So today we have a long content, so I will ask you to write down your questions because it's likely that your questions will be addressed in the end of the session when I share the template we have developed, and I'm going to show an example on the template. So I'm showing how to use these tools on the template with a concrete example. So it may be that your doubts will be addressed when I do that. But if you have another question, if you think your question is urgent and important, you can leave it on the chat or Q&A box, and Gustavo will help me reading your questions. So let's start talking about stakeholders mapping, which is the third step of our practical guide. So what are stakeholders? So here we have a picture of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, because this training was designed for organizations and people that are willing and intending to participate at COP29 and COP30. So looking at this conference, you know, what are the stakeholders? So I'm going to give some examples of stakeholders regarding the UNF, the Conference for Climate Change. So negotiators from various countries, they are stakeholders. Journalists who will cover the COP are also stakeholders. Members from various constituencies, academia representatives, future generations, they are important. They are interested, they are impacted by climate change, so they are stakeholders. Communities affected by climate change worldwide, animals, forests. So stakeholders are parts or actors that are affected or they are interested by the policy or the issue you are working with. So it's important to map all of these stakeholders. Even if you cannot engage and talk directly to them, like animals, you may not engage with animals directly, but you can engage with organizations that defend the rights of animals, right? You can, future generations, they are not born yet, but you can engage with young climate movements that represent the voices of future generations. So stakeholders are all of the parts that are interested or affected by a certain policy or regulation. And they are broad and they are diverse. Now, why is it so important to map stakeholders? And we'll talk a lot about this today. You know, I cannot stress enough how much importance stakeholder mapping has. And the main reason why it is important to map stakeholders is because advocacy strategies aim at getting decision makers to act according to our goals. So when we're talking about advocacy, as we talked on the previous workshop, we are negotiating change. So we're negotiating change on policies, regulations, conferences, and you know, a lot of different types of policies, and we want the decision makers to embrace our advocacy vision. And it is important to map stakeholders. The main and first reason, it's because we need to understand who are the decision makers involved. In other words, we need to understand and map who are the individuals or groups with the formal power to make the intended decision. And then it's also important to understand the influencers. In other words, the individuals or groups with the power to influence decision makers. So there are many reasons why it is important to map stakeholders, but this is the main one. We need to start looking at the picture and understanding who are the decision makers. And oftentimes it's not easy to access decision makers directly. So we need to map influencers. So who are the people we can engage with that are able to influence the decision makers, okay? It's also important to map stakeholders because we need political intelligence. Political intelligence, political information, political data is super important on every advocacy project. And we'll talk about this during the training. So when we are crafting our messages in our communication plan, the more we know our audiences, our stakeholders, the better will be our messages. So stakeholders map is like the foundation of this work. It's very important to map your stakeholders in details. And how do you map stakeholders? So stakeholder mapping is a research. So you can read reports, analyses, proposals, position papers, scientific articles, policy papers, news reports, social media profiles. You can watch interviews given by experts affected by the problem or issue you're tackling. And when there is no information available in any of these sources, you can call people. You can call people, you can engage with people you know to ask information about these stakeholders. So after you map the stakeholders, you should start categorizing the stakeholders. And you can categorize stakeholders in many different ways, but the minimum, like the basic information you need is understanding whether they are supporters, neutral, opponents, or champions. So what do I mean by supporters? Supporter is a stakeholder that shares a common advocacy vision, that want the same change that you do. So they are potential allies or potential partners. Neutrals are people that you don't know their positioning yet. You may need to engage with them directly to understand their positioning. And neutral can also be people that have position about the issue or the policy you're tackling, but they have made very neutral comments that you cannot really understand if they're in favor or against it. Are people that have a different vision, advocacy vision, or they have positioned themselves against your advocacy goals. Or it can also be people that are publicly attacking your organization. So this would be an opponent. And a champion is someone that is very enthusiastic about your advocacy goals or your advocacy vision, and they have a lot of power. So they are either important influencers or they are the decision makers themselves. So this is the difference between a supporter and a champion. A supporter is someone that shares this common vision with you, but they may not have so much power to influence the game. Whereas the champions are the people that can influence. They can influence the decision makers or they have the decision power themselves. So after you mapped your stakeholders, it's important to understand how they are positioned on this arena where you're working on. And here I pause to introduce the first tool, which is the stakeholder map. It's a very simple tool. This is an Excel tab, but you can do this in another workspace that you prefer. So here we have separated the tab in different columns. So we have name, sector, institution, and role, brief profile, interests, and category. And when I talk about interests, remember when we talked in the previous workshop about negotiating change? It's important to have some talking points when you start a negotiation or a meeting if you have time. So the interest would be these talking points, how do you attract the attention of this stakeholder? And you can do this while you are mapping the stakeholders. For some people, you may not find this information, so you can fill in after you engaged. So this would be a simple, very simple stakeholder map to start with, okay? We are going to show this later on the template, and I'm going to provide an example. So we will look at these tools later on with a practical example. So after you have mapped and categorized the stakeholders, it's very critical to prioritize your target audience. So if you have a lot of stakeholders, you may not be able to engage with all of them. Thus, it is very, very important to prioritize depending on your resources, your people resources available. If you don't prioritize, you can get lost. So the next tool I'm going to share with you, it's the stakeholders matrix. And the stakeholder matrix is important because it helps you prioritize engagement activities. So again, this is a very simple stakeholder matrix, and you can do it in Miro or any other workspace you prefer. So the stakeholder matrix is like this graph where you have two axes. So on the vertical axis, we are analyzing the interests the stakeholders have in your advocacy goals, or how much open they are for your advocacy vision. So we are analyzing if they have more interest or less interest. And on the other axis, we are analyzing the power to influence. So on the right, we have stakeholders that have more power to influence the policy you were tackling. And on the left side, we are analyzing, we are placing the stakeholders that have less influence power. And again, I'm going to show this in an example on the end of the workshop. But this is how a stakeholder matrix looks like, and helps you to identify who are the priorities or who are the stakeholders that are most important for you, or the ones that are more capable of advancing your advocacy agenda. And they are placed here on this upper right part of the graph in pink. So in this example here, Alice T and Arnold P would be your most, let's say, your main priorities, right? The people you must keep in mind, because they have a lot of interest in your advocacy goals. And they also have a lot of power to influence the policy you want to work with. So in other words, the stakeholder matrix is a tool that helps you visualize better, to see better. It's a more, let's say, graphic manner to see and analyze your stakeholders. Okay, so now let's move on to the fourth step on the advocacy guide, which is creating your advocacy narrative or creating your communications plan. So as we said on the previous workshop, advocacy has a lot to do with our power to influence and negotiate change, right? Therefore, the way we communicate with our stakeholders is critical to impel the change we aim to achieve. So communications is something that it's very essential, it's very important within an advocacy plan. And there are many ways and strategies and frameworks to develop an advocacy plan, an advocacy narrative or a communications plan. Here, because this is a practical guide, we are talking about the basic steps of advocacy communications, which includes, we'll talk about developing your key messages, creating an impelling call to action, and identifying spokespeople. So these are the steps we're going to address today. But if this was a course about advocacy and communications, we could talk about other different things. But we are focusing on these three because they are the, let's say, initial steps, the basic steps to have a communication strategy within your advocacy plan. So talking about key messages. Key messages are the foundation of your advocacy action or advocacy campaign. So every advocacy strategy must be based on a strong, concise, and convincing message or group of messages that communicate the problem and the desired change. And well-crafted messages are important for many reasons, but above all because they generate engagement and coherence. So when you're talking about key messages, when you're delivering your key messages to your audiences, to your stakeholders, you want to create engagement. You want people to engage in the vision you are proposing, on the change you are addressing. So the key messages, they must, awaken people's ability to act towards the change we're proposing. And coherence is important because when you have a campaign, an advocacy campaign with a lot of stakeholders, you need to have coherence. In other words, you need people to repeat the same messages. Otherwise, everything will get a little bit loose. So the coherence is important because then your stakeholders start repeating the same messages and you create this critical mass of knowledge about the issue you're tackling. So above all, key messages are important because they help you create engagement and coherence among the different stakeholders. Now, it's very important to remember that using complex, long, or vague messages will weaken your ability to influence your target audience. The messages help define how your advocacy objective will be perceived. So you don't want to have long or vague messages. It's important that they are let's see some tips for crafting clear and effective messages. It's important that your message summarizes the issue you are addressing. So you have to present the issue or the problem you are addressing in a very straight to the point manner. You don't want to be too complex or too complicated, but you need to present, what is the issue? What's the impact this issue is causing? The messages must present the advocacy vision in an inspiring manner. So remember on the previous workshop that we said that advocacy is part art and part science. This is the artistic side of advocacy. You need to talk and create messages that are inspiring, that engage people, that motivate people. They must include the actions you want the audience to take. So when people get in touch with your key messages, they need to understand what is the next step. Do they need to vote in a certain way? Do they need to participate in a petition? Do they need to address a certain message in their speech? What do you want them to do if they embrace your advocacy vision? It's important to keep your message short, simple, and straight to the point. And this is very important because you need to remember that when you or your spokespeople engage with stakeholders, you don't want to read the text, right? Because it's very boring if you read the text. You want to address the messages by memory. You want to do a conversation. So if your messages are short and simple and straight to the point, you are not going to forget them. If they're too long, too complex, you may forget them or you won't be able to deliver them effectively. It is important to avoid slangs or jargons unless your audience is formed by youth or students. But usually, since our audiences are formed by policymakers and their languages tend to be more formal, it's important to avoid slangs and jargons, or, unless you're talking to a very technical audience, don't use jargons from, too scientific terms. And they must be evidence-based. We'll talk about this in a minute, but it's on the environment that you guys work on. It's very important to be evidence-based when you prepare your messages. Refer to studies, to data that will give your messages credibility. And the most important tip of all, messages should be tailored to your audiences. And thus, this is why it's so important to map your stakeholders, because when you map your stakeholders, you are able to understand, their style, their languages, their needs, and then you can adapt the messages. And very, spokespeople that are very experienced, they know how to adapt the messages. It's important to be able to adapt the messages. Again, so I want to mention again that, advocacy on the international level, requires solid evidence. So that's why it is so important to have evidence-based messages. They need to be strong evidence to reinforce your proposed solution. And they are also very important on the climate diplomacy environment that you want to participate in. Okay, so we talked about key messages. Now we're going to talk about the call to action. And the call to action is very important, especially when you are developing an advocacy campaign, which is like a campaign has a lot of events, has a large number of stakeholders. So if you are organizing an advocacy campaign that will involve different spokespeople, different activities, actions, it is key to have a very well-defined call to action. If you're organizing an advocacy action that is has a short duration, it's not so critical to have a call to action. So here I'll say that a call to action is essential for campaigns, not so much for punctual advocacy actions or activities. So the call to action, or CTA, is an invitation for stakeholders to embrace your advocacy vision and act towards it. This is the call to action. It's a very short, straight to the point messages that is like this invitation, you know, so what do you want people to do? You know, you want them to embrace your advocacy vision. So what is your advocacy vision and how they can act towards it? So it's a very straight to the point message. It's very much used on printed or digital materials for campaigns. It helps creating coherence and increases your share of mind. So when people start repeating your call to action, this will make your campaign has a lot more share of mind and be remembered by people, by stakeholders, and by decision makers. So here are some quick examples of call to actions. So ban fossil fuel incentives on the tax reform. Stop child labor in country X by signing our petition. Expand elderly immunization in this country by joining our campaign. These are some examples. So good call to actions will make stakeholders want to know more about your campaign or advocacy action. Then you can introduce the key messages. So when you're dealing with a large number of stakeholders, the call to action is like this way to open people's interests to hear your key messages. Okay, so we have talked about key messages and call to action. Now, I'd like to say that there are 3 very important questions when planning an advocacy action. An advocacy action regarding the communication plan or the advocacy narrative. So the first question is, what is the message? Then who will receive the message? Or who is your audience? And the last question that we will address now is who will deliver the message? The spokespeople are the messengers. They are the ones who communicate, and they are as important as the message itself. So identifying powerful spokespeople will give credibility, legitimacy, persuasion to your and knowledge to your advocacy action or advocacy campaign. So it's very critical to identify the right spokespeople for your campaign or for your activity. And it's very important to remember that it's more strategic to have spokespeople from outside of your organization, such as members of your coalition, and academia specialists, social media influencers, or members of the government. When the spokespeople are not from your organization, your mission will be to engage them and support them to fulfill the task of being an effective spokesperson. So large advocacy campaigns with several stakeholders may require a number of spokespeople. So the more stakeholders you have, the more the larger number of spokespeople that you're going to have, that you're going to need. And again, this is also why we categorize and analyze stakeholders to identify appropriate messages and spokespeople to interact with them. So when you're organizing a large campaign, it is important to differentiate messages. So you have sets of key messages for different audiences. But this is a more advanced communication tactic. We won't discuss this here, but just for you to keep in mind that you may need to have different groups of messages if you are working on a large campaign with a large number of stakeholders. And also, I'd like to stress the importance of training your spokespeople, especially if they are from outside of your organization. It's very critical to train stakeholders, to train your spokespeople, because they may not be familiar with the messages, or they may not be familiar with the type of event you are organizing. So train the spokespeople. Lots of organizations provide media training for spokespeople, especially when they need to give media interviews. That can be a little bit tricky. So it can be a media training, or you can organize a small training, but it's very important to make sure your spokespeople are trained to deliver the messages, and they may need a number of trainings. So this is a very important step on your advocacy narrative within your advocacy plan. Okay, so here it's another tool, the third tool we are sharing today, which is the communications plan. This is a very basic version of our communication plan. Complete and communication plan could be much longer, but to start with, this is like the basic step to start developing your communication plan within your advocacy engagement plan. So on this communication plan, you would say who is the spokesperson or spokespeople for your advocacy goal, what is your call to action, and you should elaborate at least 3, ideally between 3 and 5 key messages that will support your campaign or action. And again, I'm going to show an example when we talk about this template by the end of the workshop. I'd like to pause a little bit just to see if there are important questions or comments, or if we can move on.
There is a question from Juan Marina regarding the previous step, the stakeholders mapping. He's asking, how do I reduce the mapping to the universe attending COP29?
So Juan, when you are, I'm not sure if you were in the previous workshop, but I left an activity, like a homework after the first workshop, which was to identify 2 advocacy goals for your participation at COP29. So when you have your advocacy goal, you have like a, how can I say this, a sample of what you want to do at COP29, and based on the goal you have identified, you can start mapping, the stakeholders that are related to your advocacy goal. So you're not mapping everyone that is participating in COP29, but just the stakeholders that are related and that can impact your advocacy goal. I would suggest, we're going to talk about this later, but I suggest you map between 10 and 40 stakeholders for COP, because this is how much, let's say, it's a realistic number of stakeholders you can engage during COP29. Let me see if I have other questions here. Okay, but we're going to talk about this later on. So let's move on with the presentation. Can you see my screen again?
Yes.
So moving on, now we are going to talk about the 5th step on our practical advocacy guide, which is the advocacy tactics. So we started discussing them on the previous workshop, and we said that advocacy is a broad field that encompasses tactics from both lobbying and activism. So we saw there are many different tactics that advocacy could embrace. We have talked a little bit about these different categories, which is the direct engagement. That is a tactic more related to lobbying. We talked about communications as another potential field within advocacy, political manifestations that are more related to activism, and institutional capacity, which is an advocacy trend that is more recent. So we have discussed this on the previous workshop. I want to go a little bit deeper on this topic. And to start with, let's talk about direct engagement. So as I said, direct engagement is an advocacy tactic more related to lobbying. And it's usually applied when you have access to decision makers or when there isn't much time to create political pressure, or when there is a voting or elaboration of a policy in place and you need to be very quick and timely to influence this voting or the elaboration of this policy or report. It's also used when you need to address very punctual terms or details. So due to the nature of the advocacy activities that take place during the COPs, we'll prioritize this tactic on the training. So because this training is targeted for people that want to participate at COP29 and COP30, we believe the direct engagement modality tactic is the one that you may need more regarding your participation in COP29 or COP30. So some of the activities related to the direct engagement include meetings with decision makers or key influencers, participation in events or organization of events, sending letters and emails, preparing formal meetings or side events, sharing research results and public or policy papers, participation in public hearings. So these are some activities that has to do with the direct engagement tactic. And later on, when we talked about monitoring, we will also talk about key performance indicators, so KPIs that are related to each of these tactics. So the communication field within the advocacy is very much used when you expect to raise awareness about an issue and thus create political pressure. This tactic is critical when you cannot access decision makers or when decision makers are highly political and respond to visibility stimulus. So some activities related to this tactic is provide, give interviews, organize, elaborate press releases, elaborate opinion articles or op-eds, doing social media outreach or campaigns, doing paid advertising, preparing signature gathering campaigns. So communication is used when you want, the society to embrace your advocacy vision, and you need to raise awareness about a certain issue within society. So let's say you want to discuss animal rights, and the political stakeholders, the decision makers involved on this in your country, they are not open to direct engagement, or you don't have access to key influencers. What you can do is organize a campaign to raise awareness about the issue, about animal rights issue within society, because that will create a political pressure, and the society, will pressure political stakeholders, decision makers, to vote or to act in favor of animal rights. So this strategy, this tactic is very much and largely used by civil society organizations. And it helps raising awareness, and proposing change on people's behaviors. And that creates political pressure, which affects the results of votings and elaboration of policies. So someone asked on the previous workshop about grassroots lobbying. And I'd like to, we won't talk about it in depth here because this is a more advanced advocacy strategy. But I'd like to say that grassroots lobbying is an approach that separates itself from direct lobbying by asking the general public to contact government officials concerning the issue at hand, as opposed to conveying the message to legislators directly. So when you organize a grassroots lobbying campaign, you are trying to push the change from the bottom to the up. So you want to engage with community members and ask them to contact their representatives and ask for the change they want. So it has to do with creating this political pressure that I mentioned. This is grassroots lobbying, but it's you need to have a lot of resources because you need to invest a lot on communication to organize a grassroots lobbying campaign. And it's very effective, especially when you are engaging with legislators, because legislators respond a lot to the pressure from their voters. Okay. So political manifestations is the other advocacy tactic we talked about on the previous workshop. And it's very much applied when dialogue, engagement, or diplomacy is not available. So this tactic aims at creating political tension and thus force negotiations to happen. So when a group doesn't find ways to engage with government officials or decision makers, and if you don't have any access to diplomacy or to negotiation, then the political manifestations are a way to create this tension that will force the dialogue or the negotiations to happen in a more effective way. So you can organize marches, demonstrations, you can do litigation processes, boycotts, doing public letters or open letters, doing occupations and sittings, organizing public assemblies and town hall meetings, doing symbolic plebiscites and referendums. So we're going to talk a little bit about indicators to measure the impact of these actions in a minute when we talk on the monitoring session. But an example of political manifestations, so in Brazil, for example, the indigenous communities, indigenous people are having difficulties to present and negotiate the government about their land regulation. So because they don't find more spaces to negotiate, they have organized with civil society organizations, lots of march demonstrations. They are litigating the government, they're organizing these occupations and public assemblies. And this is calling a lot of the media and the population's attentions so that they gather more support for their cause. And this also helps to create political pressure to make the government and decision makers negotiate with them. So this is how when you should apply political manifestations. And institutional capacity, as we said before, it's a more recent advocacy trend. It's mostly applied when you need to empower advocates in your alliance to either increase reach or legitimacy. This tactic is also used when you want to promote change from the bottom to the top. So the activities related to institutional capacity are developing coalitions and partnerships. So the Voices for Just Climate Action, the program that is organizing this training is a coalition, for example. You can do capacity building and trainings in advocacy, like this training we are doing now. You can do fundraising and resource mobilization and organize funding for public policies analysis in different regions. So as we talked on the previous workshop, with these international advocacy initiatives that reunites different countries, it has become very popular to develop these coalitions because they are incredibly powerful to increase legitimacy and credibility. And this helps to, raise awareness, raise capability, and also fundraising. But as we talked on the previous workshop, there are the pros and cons of developing advocacy coalitions. So this is another tactic, and later on we're going to talk about some key performance indicators to analyze the success of this tactic. And here is the fourth tool we are going to talk about, which is your engagement plan. As I said before, the direct engagement is the tactic that we're adopting on this training as, let's say, the most common to use during a COP. So this engagement plan template addresses the direct engagement activity. If you're doing a communication campaign or an advocacy coalition, the template would be a little bit different. So since this is a training and we want to be very, pedagogical and effective on the learning process, we are choosing one tactic to provide a template and ask you to fill in. So on this tool, which is the engagement plan, you are going to describe who is the stakeholder, so the person or organization you are going to engage with. You are going to describe if the meeting is scheduled. If not, how can you access a stakeholder by email, phone call, or if you need someone to help the interaction. How will the meeting happen? Is this in person, online, during a meeting, or audience, lunch, or phone call? So what is the message or messages you want to deliver to this stakeholder? I'll talk about this when I present the template, but you can either deliver all of your messages to this stakeholder or choose one of the messages that is more suitable to this type of stakeholder. Now, the most important question of your engagement plan: what is the best scenario that can come from this engagement? In other words, what result do you expect from this engagement? And this is very important to be aligned between the different members of your organization. What all of you know what you're expecting from this activity. And what resources do you need for this engagement activity? So do you need to bring studies, present data, show videos, take other people with you? So as we said on the previous workshop, advocacy is a negotiation, right? So it's important to know what is important for the other person we're engaging with. That's why we map stakeholders and we categorize and we try to understand their interests. Because when you're planning your advocacy activity or engagement activity, especially when it's a direct engagement type of activity, you need to know what to bring with you. So if this is a more technical stakeholder, you want to bring data, share studies. If it's someone that cares a lot about the human dimension, then you may show a video or share the story of a person that you met on the field. If it's someone that is very open to networking and wants to have visibility, you may want to take someone from your coalition with you, or even take a picture and say you're going to share the picture on your social media profile. For some people, like the more political stakeholders, this is very valuable. They love having visibility. So here on this session, you describe what resources you want to bring for this engagement activity. Okay, so now let's talk about the issues management, which is the sixth step of our advocacy practical guide. So implementing an advocacy strategy involves facing a set of risks. So oftentimes different political views or different perspectives on complex matters, such as climate change, the issue you are working with, may lead to conflicts. So conflicts and tensions are very common on the political environment. Hence the importance of having an issues management plan included in your advocacy planning. So on this session, we'll discuss how to deal with issues and prevent that they become crises that affects your advocacy agenda. This is what we're calling issues management. So an event becomes a crisis if it threatens lives, the environment, or the organization's reputation. So if you're dealing with an issue that may threaten the physical integrity of people, the environment, or your organization's reputation, this is an issue that can potentially become a crisis. And if you are under immediate pressure to make decisions and resolve a problem, this is a sign that you may be in the middle of a crisis. For the purpose of this training, which addresses basic advocacy steps, we won't discuss crisis management. We'll consider issues and risks are events that may lead to a crisis. So correctly identifying issues and risks will allow your organization to refine the advocacy strategy. It is important to consider which risks are worth taking. Sorry, it's written talking, but it's taking, and define measures to mitigate them. So risks can vary significantly depending on a number of factors. Let's analyze different types of risks. So we have reputational risks. So these are risks that can cause problems to your organization, to your organization's credibility, to your organization's ability to engage with people, because if you don't have a good reputation, if your organization doesn't have a good reputation, your ability to engage and influence decreases a lot. So reputation attacks on social media or on the traditional media, these are reputational risks. Risks to people, so when people's physical integrity or emotional health can be affected. So it could be either violence, physical violence, or harassment. These are risks to people. Financial risks, so risks related to your organization's ability to fund its activities are considered financial risks. Legal risks, so if you are involved on litigations or any type of legal initiative, this is a legal risk, and your organization may need to spend money and time to solve these processes. Risks to relationships, so if you lose a spokesperson or an important employee that is leading your advocacy campaign, this is considered risks to relationships. And risks of political change. So in some countries, the political system may change a lot, and changes happen very rapidly. So risks related to political change can affect a lot your advocacy strategies. Okay, so after you identify the risks, it's important to categorize. So we use these different fields of risks to map the risks, and then it is important to categorize the risks. So now the next step is to reflect, what is the probability of these risks becoming a crisis? Is this high, medium, or low? The next step, after you have identified the probability of these risks actually becoming a crisis, you want to identify actions to mitigate the risks. So give special attention to mitigate risks considered high level of becoming a crisis. So if you have a large number of risks, focus yourself on the risks that are considered high. In other words, the risks that have a higher chance of becoming a crisis. So mitigation plan means identifying actions that can neutralize risks. So when you analyze a risk, it may be necessary to partially review your advocacy strategy or advocacy activities. So for example, if you are organized a field trip to participate on an advocacy event, and you identify the place is violent and the risk for people is considered high, you may adopt a mitigation action and choose not to carry out this activity or develop a security protocol or implement online organization participation. So this is mitigation, you're finding alternatives to either neutralize or decrease the level of your risk. So a high risk may become a medium risk or a low risk. So this is mitigating your risks or developing a mitigation plan. And here is the fifth advocacy tool, which is the issues map. And again, this is a very basic issues map. So we have 3 columns. On the first, you will describe very briefly the issue or the risk you are tackling. So as we said here, they can be reputational risk, risks to people, financial risk, legal risks, risks to relationships, or risks related to political change. So you analyze in the first column the risks or issues you have identified. Then you categorize, saying if the probability of them becoming actual crisis is low, medium, or high. And in the last column, you can plan and think about activities or contingency strategies, actions that can help neutralize the effects of these risks. And we'll talk about this when I present the template with an example. Now, talking about the last step on our advocacy basic steps, which is monitoring and evaluating. So monitoring and evaluating the advocacy activities will let you know if you're moving towards accomplishing your advocacy goals. That's why they're so important. And it's important to remember that oftentimes influencing and changing public policies take years or even decades. Therefore, it's critical to monitor and evaluate periodically, because this will allow you to adapt the route if needed. So it may be that your assumption that a certain group of activities would help you move towards your advocacy goals, but then you realize that it's not helping, then you need to stop and plan again. So monitoring and evaluating will help you adapt the route if you need, and also maximize your resources. I'd like to mention that monitoring and evaluating public policy, impact on public policies can be very complex. There are courses dedicated to this issue of assessing and evaluating impact of advocacy and policy initiatives. So for this training, which covers basic advocacy steps, we'll consider the advocacy activities as our key performance indicators. So for this training, we're considering the engagement activities as our indicators of success, and their accomplishment will indicate if we are moving towards our advocacy goals. For those who are interested to investigate and understand more about how to measure the impact of advocacy initiatives and public policies, I suggest you take a look and investigate a little bit about the logical framework. This methodology has been largely adopted and used to monitor and evaluate the impact of policy initiatives, okay? So if you want to know more, take a look, do a Google research about the logical framework. So now we're talking about activities that can be considered key performance indicators to be applied for different advocacy strategies. So, for example, we talked about identifying spokespeople for a campaign to deliver a group of messages. This would be a key performance indicator. Organizing a public hearing with a policy or decision maker, influencing a vote for a bill within a legislative house could be another indicator. Influencing a decision maker's positioning, either on their speech or on their social media, could also be considered a KPI for this training. So since we talked about different styles of advocacy, let's look about different possibilities of activities that could be considered KPIs. So when we're talking about direct engagement, the number of spokespeople identified for a campaign or advocacy action could be an indicator of success. The organization of side events, public hearings with decision makers or influencers could be also considered a key performance indicator. Influencing the voting of a bill within a legislative house could also be considered an indicator, and presenting key messages to key stakeholders. So the number of key stakeholders that you are able to engage and present your messages, that is an activity that can be considered an indicator. When we're talking about organizing communications campaigns within advocacy campaigns, the number of people impacted by digital campaigns or followers on a social media profile could be an indicator. The quality and number of influencers supporting an advocacy action. So if you, let's say, organize a hearing or an online event, the number of influencers that participate, that could be an indicator of success. The number of opinion articles or op-eds published, or the number of articles on tier 1 outlets. All of these are potential activities and KPIs to measure the impact of your advocacy action. So the number of people in marches or demonstrations, when we're talking about political manifestations, the quality of decisions, whether favorable or unfavorable on a litigation process, this could also be considered a KPI. The number of people or organizations endorsing a public letter, the quality and number of supporters, spokespeople participating in an assembly. This could be indicators of success for your political manifestations, activities within your advocacy campaign. And when we're talking about institutional capacity, the number of people participating on a training or capacity building initiative could be your KPI. The development of new spokespeople to defend a campaign, or a number of regions covered by a program, like, let's say, the Voices for Just Climate Action, or many others. The increase on the number of representatives from a certain region on a policy-making initiative or decision-making process. So it could be that the participation of more representatives from the Global South during COP29 or COP30 could be a potential KPI for a program, an initiative on institutional capacity that is doing advocacy through building institutional capacity. So these are examples of KPIs you can adopt in your advocacy activities. And now I'm going to share the 6th tool, which is the monitoring tool. And again, it's a very simple tool. You have this Excel tab with different columns. As I said before, we are using the direct engagement as an example to apply on this template. So here on the first column, you describe the activity or the activities that you developed. You mention if they happened or not, if you met the results you were expecting. Here can be yes, no, or partially. If yes, why did you meet the results? So what were the lessons learned on the process? If no, why do you think you couldn't meet the results expected? Do you need to follow up with the stakeholder that is related to this engagement activity? If you do need to engage, again, by when you need to do this? And will you need extra resources to follow up, such as sharing studies, information, or contacts from other people? So this is a monitoring tool that you need to do after you come back from COP29 or COP30. You can fill in this monitoring tab so that you can keep track of your activities and results. Okay, I'm going to pause a little bit to see if there are questions or comments that I need to address.
There are two questions in the Q&A box, Marina. The first one is from Anisur, who is asking how to select more than one issue in your advocacy goals. I guess that's the meaning of the question. How to select more than one issue in advocacy goals. I guess you covered this in the previous session when you were asking about prioritizing and setting goals.
I didn't really understand. So is the question about issues mapping, like when we're talking about risks? No.
I guess it refers to the first step about choosing your advocacy goals, and perhaps.
Yes, and I recommend you watch the previous workshop, which is the third workshop on our training. That's when we discussed how to prioritize and identify your goals. Thank you for your question.
There's another one from Manawana. It's a question on the template. Does it mean we have to send you the position paper first?
No, you don't need to share your materials. I'm going to talk about this now, about this bonus opportunity, how it works. So before I share the bonus opportunity, let me see the other question that came from Marcus. How do we deal with political hurdles in policy implementations? Because the political tactics suggested demonstration and litigations will only slow down implementation further. So, as I said, Marcus, political intelligence is very important. That's why one of the reasons why we map stakeholders and we analyze stakeholders, because stakeholders help us gather political intelligence and information that will be very critical when we're mapping issues and risks, and political hurdles can be part of these risks. I don't understand the relation that you did with the litigation and demonstration process, but if you decide to do litigation and manifestations, usually this type of tactics, they are applied when you don't have the possibility of dialogue. So if in your system you don't have this possibility of diplomacy, dialoguing, or negotiating, then you should opt for these tactics, okay? If you have the possibility of negotiating and interacting with your stakeholders and decision makers, I suggest you adopt the other blocks of tactics, like direct engagement or communication campaigns. Have other questions here on the chat? Okay, so to address the question about the bonus opportunity and the template, let me share my screen again, and we'll talk about it. This is a very important step. Can you see my screen? Yes, okay. So this training has a bonus opportunity, which means that up to 10 organizations will be selected to receive a coaching session to review its advocacy plan for COP29 or COP30. So if your organization is interested on receiving this coaching session, you need to fill in the advocacy plan template and the form. So both the form and the template, they're available on this link. Gustavo, please share the link on the chat. And you need to do this by November 3rd, which is Sunday, next Sunday. So if you're interested, if your organization is interested on, getting to understand better how to apply these tools for your specific goals for COP29 or COP30, I suggest you fill this form and the template that we are providing you. You note down your questions, try to map everything you're not understanding or not making sense. And then you can send the template, by the email. So you'll find my email on this link. And if you are selected to receive the coaching session, we'll contact you and ask you to choose an available spot on the trainer's agenda. And we're going to schedule a 1-hour session to review your plan and answer your questions if you have specific questions related to your government or how to better address your needs on these advocacy goals for COP. We'll talk about it on the coaching session. So this is it about the bonus opportunity. Do you have doubts about the bonus opportunity? I'm going to share the template with you in a minute, but before I do that, I want to check if you have questions about this coaching session and the bonus opportunity. So the coaching one asks when this session would happen. So it would happen from next week or the week of the 11th. So we are prioritizing people that may be available to do it next week. So which is before COP starts. There is no limitation. So as long as there are people from one organization only, it's fine. You can join as many people as you wish. So Juan also asked if there is a limitation in the number of people that can participate on the session. There is no limitation as long as there are people from one organization, not different organizations, because we'll be discussing your advocacy goals for COP29 or COP30. Session will be online. You'll find all the information on the link Gustavo shared. But I'd like to emphasize that the sessions will be available in English or Portuguese, and there won't be simultaneous translation. So you need to be able to participate on the session either in Portuguese or English. And it's very important that you fill in the template that is available on the link. If you send the template empty, we won't be able to consider you for this session because we need to know what you're planning, what your doubts are, so that this session can be helpful for your organization. Any other questions about this coaching session, about the bonus opportunity? Okay, if not, I'm going to share the template with you. So I'm going to do an example. I have filled this template with a practical example, and then you can make questions after or while I'm presenting. You can open your mic and make questions. But the idea is that I show this example so that you can understand how you're going to fill in the template after this workshop. Okay. So can you see the template on my screen?
Yeah.
Great. So this is what the template looks like. It has all of these sessions: advocacy goals, landscape map, stakeholder map, matrix of stakeholders, communication plan, engagement plan, issues management, and monitoring. So these are the tools we talked about today and on the previous workshop last Tuesday. So advocacy goal Here is a tab where you are going to describe your advocacy goals for COP29 or COP30. The room is full of climate specialists, so I'm not choosing an example related to climate change because I'm not a climate change specialist. So to avoid misconceptions, I'm going to choose about another. The example is another from another field. So I asked you on the previous workshop to identify up to 2 goals for COP29 or COP30, okay? Not more than that, because you are starting to plan. This is a basic training, so don't choose too many goals. For the sake of this exercise, it's better if you have, 1 or 2 goals in mind. So here in our example, our advocacy goals are, the first is raise awareness about the importance of HPV immunization for men by sharing the findings of my organization's position paper about case study, HPV vaccine for boys from 10 to 13 years old with healthcare professionals and government representatives. And my other goal is influence the specialists on the immunization panel by identifying 2 technical spokespeople to address the issue of HPV on boys. So these are the 2 advocacy goals I'm working with on this example. And although this is a different field, we're talking about healthcare, you can have very close, very similar goals on your COP activities. So as this is an exercise, I'm going to choose one of these goals, okay, to do the exercise with you. So let's choose the first goal, raise awareness about the importance of HPV immunization for men by sharing the findings of my organization's position paper about case study HPV vaccine for boys between 10 and 13 years old with healthcare professionals and government representatives. The second tab, which is the landscape map, is where you summarize in your own words what you understood from the policy arena you were working on. So for you guys, this is the UNFCCC, the climate diplomacy, it's how to navigate the COP arenas. So it's all the content that Marina Esteves has delivered on the first and second workshops. So in my example, as I'm talking about vaccines, if I was going to fill this, I would answer these questions. How is the healthcare system established in this country? What are the challenges related to male health and public healthcare services? How is the immunization program structured? How do people access vaccines in this country? So you can list questions you have, and then you can answer them to summarize the landscape arena that you're working on. Then we can go to the stakeholders map. So here you're talking about the stakeholders related to your goals for COP29 and COP30. But since my example has to do with HPV vaccine for men and boys, I have done, this is a fictitious stakeholder mapping, just to share with you how does this work in a practical example. So I have mapped some fictitious stakeholders. The first is Arnold P. Arnold is from the government. So his sector is government institution. He's the director of the Immunization National Program within the Ministry of Health. His profile, he's a professor with 15 years of academic research and recently joined the government. His interests are, or his profile interests, he's a technical stakeholder interested on data and information. He's a member of the government's party and has close relationships with the Ministry of Health and many legislators. He has spoken in several events about the importance of expanding the immunization program. So he's interested in data, information. He may be interested in networking because he has lots of close relationships with ministries, with government representatives and legislators. In the category, he's a supporter. You know, he's someone that is a potential supporter, like a potential partner or a potential ally. And this is something you may want to check, you know, when you engage with him, you may want to check if he's really a supporter, what is his view on HPV vaccination for men, but beforehand, you think he's a supporter. Then you have LCT. Alice is from the civil society. She's the leader of the Male Health Observatory. She's a trained nurse and renowned healthcare activist with broad international network and connections within the government. She's interested in visibility within the private sector and government to fundraise because she needs to raise funds for her organization. And you think she may be a champion, and you are going to check this after you engage with her. And why is she considered a champion? It's because she's enthusiastic about your advocacy vision, which is expanding HPV vaccine for men. You have seen her doing interviews and talking about the importance of HPV vaccines for men. So you think she can be considered a champion or even a spokesperson for this project. Then you have John V. He's a sectorial representative. He's the president of the Alternative Medicine Association. He's a medical expert and leader of the anti-vaccine movement. And you know he's interested in networking and political connections. He has given several interviews discouraging families to vaccine children against HPV. So he knows it's written detractor, but it's opponent, the name of this category. So you know that he's against, sorry for this mistake, it's not detractor, it's opponent, but in your template, this will be correct. He's opponent because his advocacy vision is against your advocacy vision because he leads the anti-vaccine movement and you're in favor of vaccination. So he's an opponent. Then we have Lauren J. She's from the legislative body. She's the chief of staff to Senator Mary B. She's a public health specialist who has a broad experience within the Senate, having worked for the Senate Health Caucus. She's interested in up-to-date data on public health budget, and she is considered neutral. You don't know yet her positioning regarding the expansion of the HPV vaccine for men and boys, but you know she's very interested on the issue of healthcare budget and public healthcare budget. So this is how you would start mapping your stakeholders. You analyze their profile, their interests, and you make assumptions about the category they fit. Some of them you may have already engaged with, so you know for sure in which category they are. But if not, you can make an assumption and then you can confirm after you engage with them. This is the matrix, your stakeholders matrix. So here we are analyzing, as I said, the interest these stakeholders have in your advocacy goals versus their power to influence the policy you're tackling. So stakeholders that have more interest in your advocacy goals, they would be placed on the upper part of the graph. Stakeholders with less interest in your advocacy goals would be based on the lower part of the graph. And stakeholders with a lot of power to influence the policy or change you are proposing would be on the right side of the graph. And stakeholders with less power to influence would be placed on the left side of the graph. So I have put more or less where these stakeholders would be placed. So John V, he has some power to influence, but since he's from the anti-vaccine movement, he's not open, he's not interested in your advocacy goals, so he's here. Lauren J has, because she works in the Senate, she has, let's say, more power to influence legislation on public health immunization. and you think she's open to your goals, but she's not like an open, enthusiastic. Then you have Alice T. She's very open, very interested in your advocacy vision, but she doesn't have so much power to influence. And Arnold P. would be the one with more power to influence this policy. And you think he's, as you have read, he's open about immunization. So you assume he's open and interested in your advocacy goals. So the stakeholder matrix helps you visualize better who are the stakeholders that are, let's say, your priorities, or that could help advance your advocacy agenda more quickly. And in this case, they would probably be LCT and Arnold P. But this is something you need to check after the engagement activities happen. You can come back here and change people and say, okay, he has more power of influence than I imagine. Then you change John V from here to here. And then you can change the stakeholders place on the stakeholders matrix. And it's okay if it changes, because this is a very live and very dynamic tool. So for the moment, these would be your priorities, the people you need to pay more attention, because they are the ones that probably can help advance your advocacy goals more effectively. Next tab is your communication plan. So in this example, we have identified that Alice T is the spokesperson for our campaign. The call to action would be expand HPV vaccine for boys on the National Immunization Program. And the key messages, or the messages that are going to support the campaign, are HPV virus causes several types of cancer that affects men. So this is the first message about the problem, the issue you're tackling. Then there is another message about the impact. Government statistics from 2023 estimated that 32,000 men are affected by cancer caused by HPV. 8% of them cause death. So this is another message about the impact of the diseases, the cancers caused by HPV. Now there is another message talking about the solution. So the expansion of HPV vaccine for boys among 10 to 13 years old could prevent deaths caused by cancer related to HPV virus. So this is a message about the solution. And a final message about the impact of the solution in the long run. Study X from the University Z estimated that the expansion of HPV vaccine for boys would cause savings on the healthcare budget of around 20 million in 10 years to the prevention of diseases caused by HPV. Okay, this is a very fictitious example, but just to show how the messages, they are straight to the point, they are concise, and they address the problem, the impact of the problem, the solution, and the benefits of the solution. So these are the messages that you need to deliver when you meet your stakeholders. Now, the engagement plan, since this is a direct engagement tactic, you are going to list all the activities you are preparing to engage with these stakeholders. So here, the first activity is you're organizing a workshop for 35 healthcare professionals to talk about HPV immunization. The stakeholder name, or the main person that is going to lead the event, is LCT, who is the head of the Male Health Observatory. Here you can also list the 35 healthcare professionals. If you organize an event, you can put the name of everyone. But the main stakeholder here is LCT, because she'll be the speaker, the coordinator of this event. So here put the date and hour of the event to take place, to happen on November 22nd from 8 to 10 a.m. Here you describe how the event will happen. This is an in-person meeting at the Bloom Hotel. Here you select the messages that you deliver to this audience. So since this is a technical expert meeting, the message you want to explore more on this event is about the solution, which is the expansion of HPV vaccine for boys among 10 to 13 years old could prevent deaths caused by cancer related to the HPV virus. So it could deliver all the messages, but here you're stressing that for these stakeholders that are technical stakeholders, this message is the one that needs to be explored further, okay? So what is the scenario, the best result that can come from? I'm listening the translation, so I think the translator is out of the channel. I think, okay. Thank you. So the best result or the best scenario that can come from this activity is identifying at least 2 champions or spokespeople within this audience. And here, what resources do you need on this engagement? So you need to prepare slides about the study which identified that HPV vaccine for boys could prevent deaths. So this is the main resource you need to present for these stakeholders on this event. So this is how you do, you can, let's say you're having lunch with Lauren, who is the chief of staff of Senator Mary B. So you can do the same thing and describe how this lunch will happen, when, where, what messages you need to deliver, what the best result you can have from this. It could be even a phone call. A phone call is a type of engagement, direct engagement. It could be a public hearing, so you're participating in a public hearing on the Healthcare Commission in the Senate, so you can describe all the activities where you're going to engage with your stakeholders. So you do this here. Issues management plan. So you are going to list the risks you have identified. You are going to categorize the risks and identify actions to mitigate these risks to avoid that they become crises. So on this example, fake news may affect the reputation of the vaccine. So since there is an anti-vaccine movement, you may get prepared to deal with fake news. This is a high risk, that has high probability of becoming a crisis. And to neutralize this risk, you can develop a campaign about immunization efficacy, tackling social and healthcare professionals. So this is a potential action to neutralize this risk. Another risk you identify is that vaccine side events may cause panic among families. So sometimes large vaccination campaigns can cause some side events, some side collateral events. So they have low probability of becoming a crisis, but you can develop a Q&A for the population about the safety profile of the HPV vaccine to help neutralize the panic that this could create among families. Another risk that can affect a lot of advocacy actions or campaigns or projects is that you organize an event and the spokesperson or the speaker on this event has logistic problems and doesn't show up for the event. This is a risk that could affect your organization's reputation, right? Depending on the city, if your city has too many traffic jams or a very complicated logistic traffic jams, then you can say this is like a medium probability of becoming a crisis. So to neutralize this risk, you can identify and train a backup speaker for the event. And you can also explain the city logistics for the specialist who is going to be the main spokesperson and make sure she or he knows how to commute to the event. This would help mitigate the risks related to this person not showing up for the event. Another risk related, this is a political risk. So members of the House of Representatives are organizing a public hearing to discuss the impact of increasing health spending. So this is a risk that could affect your advocacy goal to expand vaccine for boys. The chances of this becoming a real and actual crisis is low, but you can neutralize this risk by understanding the talking points presented during this public hearing and develop a position paper to address how vaccine can cut costs on the medium and long run. So this is a mitigation plan, an issues management plan. And the last tab here is monitoring. So you do this after you come back from COP. So here you're going to list the activities that you organized to directly engage with your stakeholders. In this case, let's say it was the workshop for 35 healthcare professionals about HPV immunization. Here, did it happen? Yes or no? Did you meet the results? Like, did you achieve the best scenario you expected? On this example, you could say yes, no, or partially. On this example, we are saying partially. If yes, why? So here you can say the event happened and we had all the 35 guests present. However, we couldn't identify 2 technical spokespeople for the campaign, which was the best scenario we were waiting for. We noticed Alice T, who is the speaker, who was the speaker of the event, is not on top of the epidemiologic data from the study. She'll need more training to transmit the messages in a more technical manner to persuade healthcare professionals. So here you are explaining why you think you could achieve, like the event happened, it was okay, you had all the guests present, but you didn't actually identify the spokespeople that you wanted to have identified. This is like a review, why you think things weren't achieving the best scenario possible. Don't have any results, you can explain why, why you think it didn't work out well. Do you need to follow up with these stakeholders? So do you need to get in touch with them again? Yes or no? If yes, by when you need to do this? In this case, let's say by December 4th. And will you need extra resources to follow up, such as sharing studies, information, or contacts with these stakeholders? On this example, let's say you need to prepare a thank you note for all attendees and attach reference of the studies mentioned during the event. This would be resources for your follow-up regarding these direct engagement activities. So this is the template that you're going to find on the link we have shared on the chat. And I'd like to open to read or listen to your comments, questions, doubts. So on the link that Gustavo has put on the chat, Gustavo, can you put the link again for the form, please? So that people can find it easily. Thank you. On this link, you're going to find the instructions, how to download the template, the email, my email, where you should send your template, and the form that you need to fill in if you're interested in having this coaching session. And you can also send questions if you're not understanding how to use the template. You can send questions to my email as well, and I can clarify them. Okay, so if we don't have comments or questions regarding the template, I'd like to maybe invite Charlotte to conclude the workshop.
Great. Thanks so much, Marina. Yeah, this brings us to the end of our 4th session in our series. It's been jam-packed with information, tools, tips, actionable advice that we can use for COP29 and COP30. So I hope that it has been useful to you and your own advocacy goals. Hopefully, many of you will be reaching out to us about the template and getting some feedback on your specific advocacy objectives for COP29. You hopefully will also hear from us again before COP30 in about a year's time. And I'd just like to say thank you very much to Marina and Gustavo for taking us through this journey of preparing an advocacy strategy. And thank you so much to our interpreters who have made it possible to communicate across so many different languages. You will get an email with the recording from today's session and all the resources. And I think we can include in that a link to the form and the template. So please look out for that in the next few days. Otherwise, yeah, all the best for everybody who is traveling or engaging online. And I hope we have successful engagements at COP and into the future at the global level. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And please do follow along on our social media as we engage, as you have events. Please tag us and engage with us. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye. See you next time.
Bye.